1. The Hitchhiker. It was late on a Friday night when Ryan Mitchell found himself driving through the empty stretch of highway in the American Southwest. The sun had set hours ago, and the road was now just a long, endless ribbon of asphalt stretching toward the horizon. He had been on the road for several hours, and he was beginning to feel the exhaustion settling in. His plan was to make it to the next town, just a couple of hours ahead, but the vast emptiness around him made it feel like he was the last person on Earth. Ryan wasn't new to road trips. He loved the solitude of long drives, especially on remote highways. It gave him time to think, to clear his head, and to leave behind the noise of everyday life. But tonight, something felt off. The silence in the air was too thick, and the darkness too oppressive. The occasional distant rattle of his car engine was the only sound breaking the silence, but even that felt eerie. The usual rhythm of the road was missing. As he passed a long stretch of desert landscape, Ryan squinted in the rearview mirror. He thought he saw a figure standing by the side of the road, but he wasn't sure. He rubbed his eyes, chalking it up to his exhaustion. The person seemed to be just a shadow, a trick of the light. But then, as he got closer, he saw that it wasn't just a trick of the mind. There, on the shoulder of the highway, stood a man. He was tall and thin, dressed in a long coat that flapped in the wind. His hair was unkempt, and his face was hidden in the shadows. As Ryan's headlights illuminated the figure, the man turned and looked directly at him. His gaze was intense, almost unnerving. It was as if he was waiting for Ryan to notice him. Ryan slowed the car down instinctively. It wasn't often you saw hitchhikers out here in the middle of nowhere, especially this late at night. But something about the man made Ryan uneasy. His gut told him to keep driving, to ignore the stranger and just keep going. But another part of him felt pity. What if this guy was stranded, lost, and needed help? With a heavy sigh, Ryan pulled over. He cracked the window and called out, "Hey, you need a ride?" The man didn't respond right away. He just stood there, his face still hidden in the shadow of his coat. After a long pause, he stepped forward and nodded. "I've been waiting for a while. Could you give me a lift?" The man's voice was raspy, barely audible over the sound of the wind. Ryan hesitated for a moment, but then he unlocked the passenger door. The man opened it slowly and slid into the front seat. Ryan glanced at him briefly before starting the engine again. The man didn't speak for several minutes, just sat there staring straight ahead. Ryan tried to make small talk, but his passenger didn't respond. The silence between them was thick and uncomfortable. Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The man's silence was unsettling, and the way he just seemed to appear out of nowhere made Ryan's skin crawl. He tried to push the thought out of his head and focused on the road, telling himself that he was just being paranoid. But then, after a while, Ryan noticed something strange. The man had been sitting perfectly still, not moving a muscle, not even adjusting in his seat. His hands were folded neatly in his lap, and his eyes remained locked on the road ahead. It wasn't just his stillness that bothered Ryan. It was the fact that the man hadn't said a word since getting in the car. No thank you, no request for a specific destination, nothing, just silence. Suddenly, the hairs on the back of Ryan's neck stood up. He stole a quick glance at his passenger. The man's face was no longer in the shadows. It was now clear and illuminated by the dim light from the dashboard. Ryan froze in shock. The man's eyes were wide open, but they seemed hollow. His face was pale, almost ashen, and his lips were thin and cracked. He looked as if he hadn't eaten or slept in days. Ryan turned his eyes back to the road, trying to keep calm. His pulse quickened. Something was wrong. He could feel the air in the car grow heavier, thicker. And then, just as he was about to ask the man where he was going, the passenger spoke. "I don't need a ride anymore." Ryan's stomach dropped. He glanced at the man in disbelief. What did he mean? They were still miles from any town, and it was impossible to just get out here in the middle of nowhere. Before Ryan could react, the man turned to face him completely, and that's when Ryan saw it. His passenger's face had changed. It wasn't just his appearance that was different, it was his expression. The man's features were contorted into something grotesque. His mouth stretched into a wide, unnaturally large grin. His eyes were empty, black voids, and his skin looked like it was decaying. Ryan slammed on the brakes, his heart racing. But when he looked back at the passenger seat, the man was gone. The door was still closed, and the seat was empty. Ryan's breath was coming in quick gasps. He had to pull over. He wasn't sure if he had just imagined the whole thing, but he couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over him. He parked the car on the side of the road, his hands shaking as he turned off the engine. The silence outside was suffocating. Ryan stepped out of the car, his legs weak beneath him. He scanned the area, expecting to see the man standing there again, but there was nothing, just the road stretching endlessly into the night. With a shaky breath, Ryan turned to get back in the car, but as he reached for the door, he noticed something strange on the passenger seat, something he hadn't seen before. A small piece of paper, folded neatly, lay on the seat. Ryan picked it up, his fingers trembling. Unfolding it slowly, he read the message written in a neat, spidery hand. "I'm already home." Ryan felt his blood run cold. He turned around, looking frantically up and down the empty highway, but there was no sign of the man. It was as if he had never been there at all. Ryan quickly got back in the car, started the engine, and sped away, not daring to look back. As he drove down the road, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was still watching him from the darkness. And he knew, deep down, that he would never forget the hitchhiker on that lonely highway. 2. The Vanishing Gas Station. It was a cold November evening when Sophie Davis found herself on the road alone, driving through the rural highways of Nevada. She had just left a friend's wedding in Las Vegas and was heading back to her apartment in San Francisco, a long drive she had been dreading but had no choice but to make. The route she had chosen was quiet, taking her through miles of barren desert and isolated small towns. The further she got from the city, the more desolate and empty the landscape became. By the time Sophie reached the stretch of road that seemed endless, the sun had set and the moon hung low in the sky. She was tired and ready for a break, but there wasn't much in the way of rest stops on this road. Her car's gas gauge was almost on empty, and she began to feel a little anxious. The thought of running out of gas in the middle of nowhere wasn't appealing. As if on cue, she saw headlights in the distance, a small, flickering light through the dark horizon. Sophie's spirits lifted. A gas station. She wasn't sure if it was open, but she hoped it was. The road was winding, and she had been driving for hours, her eyes beginning to feel heavy. She needed to stretch her legs and fill up. As she neared the gas station, she could see the glowing neon sign flickering in the darkness. The station seemed old, a relic from another time, but it was better than nothing. Sophie pulled in and parked by one of the pumps. The station was eerily quiet, and there was no one around, not even a car in sight. But she didn't think too much of it. Maybe it was late, or perhaps the gas station was just rarely busy. Sophie got out of the car, locking the door behind her. The wind blew cold and sharp as she made her way toward the entrance of the small convenience store attached to the gas pumps. She pulled on the door, but it didn't budge. Frowning, she pulled harder, but the door was locked. There was no one inside. "Hello?" she called, knocking gently on the glass. She waited for a moment, expecting someone to appear from the back or a loudspeaker to chime in with a greeting. But there was nothing. The silence seemed to press down on her, more intense than it should have been. She tried the door one more time. Nothing. Turning around, Sophie glanced back at her car, her thoughts now growing more suspicious. She had seen a flicker of movement, a shadow moving across the pavement, but when she looked closer, there was no one there. For a split second, she considered just leaving, but she didn't want to risk running out of gas. She walked back to the pump and noticed that the gas station was oddly pristine. The pumps were new, and everything seemed well maintained, despite the fact that the place looked so abandoned. The bright lights from the station illuminated the parking lot, but beyond the reach of the glow, it was pure darkness, stretching on forever. Sophie glanced at the sign again, the same flickering neon that had originally caught her attention. She could barely make out the words, but the sign read, "Gas, open 24 hours. Yet the store door was locked, and there was no sign of life anywhere. Confused and beginning to feel uncomfortable, she checked her phone. No signal. Of course, she hadn't expected service in this remote area, but now it was beginning to feel unsettling. She decided to give the pump a try anyway, walking up to it and fiddling with the nozzle. It clicked when she tried to lift it, but no gas came out. The screen on the pump blinked and then went blank. Sophie frowned. Something wasn't right. Then, out of nowhere, a car approached from the opposite direction. A black sedan that pulled in, its headlights blinding her for a moment. Sophie squinted, expecting to see someone come out, but the sedan parked in front of the first pump, and the engine turned off. Silence again. Sophie hesitated. Should she go ask for help, or just leave? Something about this entire situation felt wrong, but she couldn't quite place it. With a deep breath, she walked toward the sedan, cautiously approaching the driver's side window. Before she could knock, the window rolled down. The man inside, middle-aged, wearing dark sunglasses despite the late hour, stared at her. Sophie was about to speak when the man raised a hand, silencing her. His lips curled into a tight smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm sorry, the station is closed," he said, his voice low and calm, though something about it felt off. "You're wasting your time here." Sophie blinked, confused. "What do you mean? The sign says it's open." She stopped herself mid-sentence. Her mind raced. The sign had definitely said it was open. She could even see the neon flickering above the pumps. But now that she thought about it, the lights on the station had been on when she arrived, but they were no longer visible, the place now dark as if it had never been lit at all. The man simply smiled again, slowly rolling up his window without another word. Sophie stood frozen, watching as the sedan slowly backed up, its headlights casting an eerie glow across the empty lot. It turned around and disappeared down the highway, leaving Sophie standing there in complete silence. Her heart raced. She turned back to look at the station. It was dark now, completely dark. No lights, no sign. Sophie's head spun, but she couldn't look away. The station was gone. There was nothing left but the dark stretch of road ahead and the black night around her. She blinked several times, certain she had to be seeing things, but the station was no longer there. No gas pumps, no sign, no convenience store. The ground beneath her feet was just dirt, the only sound her breath and the faint wind. Panic surged through Sophie. She ran back to her car, heart pounding in her chest, her breath short. She slammed the door shut and started the engine. The car roared to life, and without thinking, she peeled out of the parking lot and onto the road. Her tires squealed as she drove faster than she ever had before, not daring to look back. The night seemed to stretch on forever, but Sophie didn't stop driving. When she finally reached the next town, exhausted and shaken, she pulled into a diner, hoping to calm her nerves. The waitress, an older woman, raised an eyebrow as Sophie sat down at a booth. "You okay, hon?" she asked, glancing at Sophie's wide eyes. Sophie tried to calm herself, but the words came out in a shaky breath. "I just passed a gas station back there. It wasn't there. I don't know how." The waitress gave her a knowing look, like she'd heard this story before. "Which one?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. Sophie furrowed her brow. "The one just a few miles back on Highway 50. I swear it was there, but when I went to check..." The waitress sighed and nodded slowly, almost as if she'd been waiting for this exact moment. "Sweetheart," she said quietly, "there's no gas station there. Not anymore. Been years. There's nothing but dirt and rocks." You're not the first person to get caught up in that one. The road plays tricks on people. Sophie stared at the waitress, confused, but the woman's face was calm, too calm. Just drive careful next time, okay? And maybe stick to the main roads, she added, her voice suddenly colder. Some roads don't let you leave once they've got you. Sophie opened her mouth to respond, but her words caught in her throat. She had no idea what had just happened. All she knew was that she had driven through something that didn't belong on any map. And now, all she wanted was to forget. 3. The Old Motel. It was a crisp autumn evening when Liam and his girlfriend, Emily, set off on their road trip through the Midwest. They had been planning this vacation for months, hoping to explore the quiet, scenic routes that wound through small towns and forgotten backroads. The kind of place where people still waved to each other as they passed, and the air smelled of fresh-cut grass and wood burning in fireplaces. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway, a break from their hectic city lives. They were on the final stretch of their journey when they encountered a sign, "Last Stop Motel, 5 miles." Liam and Emily were both tired. The sun was setting, and neither of them wanted to drive much longer. The winding road they were on had become increasingly isolated, with only a few scattered farmhouses on either side. They decided to pull off the highway and check out the motel for the night. As they drove along the narrow road, the trees seemed to close in on both sides, casting long shadows over the car. Liam glanced over at Emily, who was looking out the window, quietly lost in her thoughts. She had the kind of beauty that made people stop and take a second glance, but in the dimming light, her face looked tired, a little worn from the long trip. After a few more miles, they spotted the motel. It was a small, old-fashioned place, barely visible in the fading light. A neon sign buzzed overhead, flickering intermittently. The paint on the building was chipped, and the parking lot was almost empty, save for one lone car parked near the office. The whole place seemed stuck in time, as if it hadn't changed in decades. "Well, it's not the Ritz, but I'm ready to crash," Liam said, giving Emily a reassuring smile. She nodded, though she seemed hesitant. "Yeah, I guess it'll do." They pulled into the parking lot, and Liam parked the car in front of the office. The door to the office was open, and a bell jingled as they walked in. A man stood behind the counter, his face shadowed by the low light. "Good evening," he said in a gravelly voice, barely lifting his head from the old register in front of him. "You folks looking for a room?" Liam smiled. "Yeah, just one night. We're on our way to Chicago, and it's getting late." The man nodded, his expression unreadable. "You sure about staying here? Not many folks come through these parts at this time of year." Liam didn't think much of it and handed over his ID and a credit card. "It's fine. We're both exhausted, honestly." The man handed Liam a key, the brass one with a faded tag attached to it. "Room 6. You'll find it in the back, near the trees." "Thanks," Liam said, taking the key. He glanced around the office, noticing that the place was almost unnervingly still. The air felt thick with dust, and the only sounds were the occasional buzz of the neon sign and the creaking of the floorboards under their feet. They made their way to the back of the motel. The narrow walkway was flanked by tall trees, their bare branches scraping against the walls like fingers. Liam felt an odd chill creeping up his spine, but he dismissed it as nothing more than the fall evening air. When they reached room 6, he unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was small, with 2 beds and a faded carpet. The furniture was old but functional, and the dim light cast long shadows across the walls. It wasn't luxurious, but it was clean enough. A small, cracked mirror hung above a wooden dresser, and a vintage television sat in the corner. The air smelled faintly of mildew, but it wasn't overpowering. Emily dropped her bag on one of the beds and flopped down with a sigh. "This is fine, right?" she asked, glancing at Liam. Liam shrugged. "It's not the best, but it'll do for the night. We'll get back on the road early tomorrow." As the evening wore on, They ordered takeout from a small diner across the street. Emily set the food out on the bed, and they ate, talking about everything and nothing. But the feeling of unease that Liam had felt earlier began to grow stronger. It wasn't the room. It was something about the place itself. The motel felt wrong, as though it had seen too much and wasn't ready to let go of whatever dark secrets it held. After dinner, they decided to take a walk outside to stretch their legs. The cold air hit them immediately, and the wind rustled the bare branches of the trees. They wandered down the path that led toward the woods behind the motel. The further they walked, the more the shadows seemed to grow deeper, as if the trees themselves were pulling the night in tighter. "You know, I heard some strange things about this place," Emily said suddenly, her voice cutting through the silence. "People say this motel is haunted." Liam laughed, though it didn't sound convincing even to him. "Haunted? Come on, Em. This is just an old, rundown place. People love telling spooky stories about small towns." But Emily didn't laugh. She kept walking, her eyes scanning the trees ahead. "I don't know. Something just feels off here, like it's not quite right." Before Liam could respond, he heard a faint sound, a whisper, soft but clear, coming from the woods. He froze, his heart racing. It sounded like someone calling his name. "Liam!" The voice echoed softly, almost like a distant cry. He turned to Emily, his expression serious. "Did you hear that?" Emily nodded, her face pale. "Yeah, I did. It's coming from over there." They both stared into the trees, but the darkness was thick and impenetrable. There was nothing there, just the occasional rustling of leaves and the faint whisper of the wind. But that voice, it was unmistakable. "I don't think we should be out here," Liam said, grabbing Emily's hand. "Let's get back to the room." They turned to leave, but as they walked back toward the motel, they noticed something strange. The path they had walked was no longer visible. The trees had grown closer together, the dark shadows seeming to close in on them. The motel, once in clear sight, now seemed farther away, as though it had shifted. "Liam, where's the motel?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. Liam stopped dead in his tracks, scanning the dark horizon. He couldn't see the lights of the motel, not even the flickering neon sign. The woods stretched on endlessly in every direction. Suddenly, they heard the whisper again, this time much closer. "Liam, Emily." It was a woman's voice now, pleading, as though it was coming from right behind them. Panic surged through Liam's chest. He spun around, but there was no one there, just the dark, looming trees. "Run," Liam shouted, grabbing Emily's hand and pulling her back toward where they had come from. But with every step they took, the woods seemed to stretch farther, and the motel never appeared. They ran, but the forest seemed to close in tighter with every second. The whispers grew louder, the voices of hundreds of people now, crying out from all directions. By the time the first light of dawn touched the sky, Liam and Emily had stumbled back to the main highway, breathless and terrified. They turned around, expecting to see the motel behind them, but there was nothing, just the road, the same as it had always been. The motel was gone. They stood there for a long time, trying to catch their breath, until a car pulled up alongside them. The driver rolled down the window, a man with graying hair and a weathered face. "You folks all right?" he asked, eyeing them with concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Liam opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The man just stared at them for a moment, then shook his head. "Well, you'd better be careful out here. There are some roads that they don't lead to the places you think they do." And as the car drove away, Liam and Emily looked at each other in silent understanding. The Last Stop Motel had never existed. 4. The Shadow in the Rearview. It had been an exhausting drive across the Midwest for Marcus Hayes, a young man in his late 20s who had recently moved to Chicago for work. He was used to long road trips, but this one seemed to drag on longer than usual. The cold November night seemed to stretch endlessly, with only the occasional flicker of distant lights to remind him he wasn't the only one on the road. His eyes were growing heavy, and the monotonous hum of the tires against the asphalt had become a lullaby. Marcus had been driving for hours without seeing any signs of civilization, just miles of empty highway and dark fields on either side. He glanced at the clock. It was 3:15 a.m. He hadn't planned on driving this late, but he needed to make it to the next town to find a place to rest. The GPS had indicated that there was a small town a few miles ahead with a motel, but the road had become increasingly desolate. Suddenly, in the distance, he spotted a lone light shining through the blackness. It wasn't the typical neon motel sign he had seen on previous trips. It looked more like a faint glow, like a distant lantern flickering on the edge of a forgotten road. Marcus squinted through the windshield. The light didn't seem to belong to a gas station or a town. It was coming from a small building on the side of the highway. A motel. Relieved, he decided to stop. The next nearest town was still miles away, and he didn't want to risk running out of gas or falling asleep at the wheel. He slowed down and turned onto the gravel road that led up to the motel. The sign was old, with peeling paint, and the light flickering above it buzzed intermittently. The building itself was a one-story structure, almost appearing as though it hadn't been updated in decades. The parking lot was nearly empty, with just one other car parked near the far end. Marcus pulled into a spot directly in front of the office. He stepped out of the car, his breath visible in the cold air. The silence was thick, and the only sound was the crunch of his boots against the gravel as he made his way to the office. The door opened with a soft creak as Marcus entered. The inside was dimly lit, with old wood paneling and a musty smell that filled the air. Behind the counter was an elderly woman, her hair graying and pulled back into a tight bun. She looked up at him with tired eyes, her expression blank. "Can I help you, dear?" she asked, her voice raspy. Marcus cleared his throat. "Yeah, I need a room for the night. I've been driving for hours, and I'm pretty beat." The woman didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stared at him for a long moment, as if assessing him. Finally, she nodded. "Room 12. It's down the hall, last door on the left," she said, sliding a key across the counter. "The rate's $50 for the night." Marcus took the key without questioning it. The motel was old, and the price was more than fair. He didn't need luxury, just somewhere to rest for a few hours. "Thank you," he said, turning toward the door. The woman didn't respond, just continued to stare at him. As Marcus stepped back outside, the chill hit him again. He pulled his jacket tighter around his body and made his way down the narrow path toward room 12. As he walked down the hallway, he couldn't help but notice how silent the place was. The only light came from dim, yellowed bulbs hanging from the ceiling, casting long shadows across the floor. His footsteps echoed down the corridor, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, though he couldn't quite place why. The hallway stretched on longer than it seemed it should have. He counted the doors. There should have been only 10 rooms, yet he had passed 12. It didn't make sense. Room 12 was at the very end of the hall, tucked away in the far corner. The door was slightly ajar, and as Marcus pushed it open, the stale air inside hit him immediately. The room was exactly what he had expected. Old furniture, a faded rug, a small television set, and a bed with a thick, heavy comforter. He didn't mind. He was tired, and it would do for the night. He threw his bag onto the bed and went to the bathroom to wash up. When he returned, he noticed the lamp on the nightstand was flickering. He tried to adjust the bulb, but it wouldn't stay on. Finally, he gave up and sat down on the bed. The silence was almost unbearable. He could hear nothing but the sound of his own breathing, and even that seemed muffled, as if something was blocking the air in the room. Marcus stretched out on the bed and closed his eyes, willing himself to sleep. But as the minutes passed, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. His heart began to race, and he opened his eyes, glancing around the room. There was nothing out of the ordinary. just the shadows cast by the dim light, the old furniture, and the dull hum of the overhead light bulb. Still, the unease wouldn't leave him. He rolled over and glanced at the small clock on the nightstand. It was just past 3:30 a.m. The faint buzzing of the lamp continued, adding to the oppressive atmosphere. That's when he noticed something strange. In the reflection of the mirror above the nightstand, Marcus saw a shadow move. At first, he thought it was just his eyes playing tricks on him, the reflection of a tree outside swaying in the wind. But as he stared at the mirror more intently, he saw it again, faint and indistinct, but definitely there. A shadow moving just behind him, just outside the frame of his vision. His heart began to pound in his chest. The shadow was dark and shapeless, almost like a figure, but it seemed to bend and shift unnaturally. Panic surged through him. He quickly turned his head toward the door, expecting someone to be standing there, but there was no one. The room was empty. Liam's breath caught in his throat as he turned his gaze back to the mirror. The shadow was still there, now clearer. Its shape was human, but it was distorted, its outline flickering like a flame. And then, in the reflection, he saw something that froze him to the bone. The shadow was moving toward him. His body froze, and his mind raced. He had to get out of there. He jumped off the bed and spun around. But when he turned back toward the mirror, the figure was gone. There was nothing behind him but the cold, empty room. But as he turned to leave, he caught a glimpse of something in the corner of the room. The silhouette of a person standing just outside the door. It was watching him. His heart thudded in his chest as he sprinted out of the room and down the hall. He didn't even bother to look back. He just ran, faster and faster. His feet pounding on the floor as he reached the door and flung it open. The parking lot was empty. The dark highway stretched out before him like a desolate road to nowhere. Marcus jumped into his car, slammed the door shut, and sped off into the night, his hands shaking on the steering wheel. He couldn't look back, not even once. As he drove farther away, he glanced in his rearview mirror, his pulse racing. For a brief moment, just before he turned onto the main highway, he thought he saw something in the reflection. A shadow, standing in the distance, watching him. But by the time he blinked, it was gone. The last stop motel had vanished in his rearview mirror, but Marcus knew it would never leave his mind. Some places, he realized, were never meant to be found. 5. The Silent Passenger. It was a cold January evening when Sarah Thompson decided to drive back home to St. Louis after a long weekend visiting family in Kansas City. The roads were quiet, blanketed in snow, and the air felt sharp and cold, the kind that stung your lungs when you breathed it in. Sarah had made this drive dozens of times, so she wasn't concerned. The highway was desolate, as usual. Her car's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the long stretch of road ahead. It was well after midnight when Sarah realized she was beginning to feel the effects of the long drive. The warm, comforting hum of the tires against the road had become a lullaby, and despite her best efforts to stay alert, her eyelids grew heavy. She rolled down the window, letting in the cold air, trying to shake off the exhaustion. That's when she saw it. A faint light off in the distance, just a speck on the horizon. It wasn't a gas station or a truck stop. Those were a dime a dozen on this stretch of highway. This was different. It was an old, dilapidated sign that flickered as if struggling to stay lit. The faded letters read, Pinewood Motel, and just below that, a more recent sign advertised, open 24/7. Perfect, Sarah muttered to herself, thankful for the unexpected opportunity to rest for a bit. Her car was low on gas, and her stomach growled from the lack of dinner. Besides, she wasn't going to make it much further if she didn't stop soon. She took the exit that led toward the motel, her tires crunching on the gravel as she rolled slowly toward the building. The parking lot was nearly empty, just one or two cars scattered in front of the rooms. The motel itself looked run down. Its neon sign buzzed above, giving off a faint orange glow, but everything else seemed to be frozen in time. Old, peeling paint, broken windows covered with cheap plywood, and flickering lights that didn't seem to belong in the present day. Sarah pulled into a spot near the office and shut off the engine. For a moment, she sat there, taking in the eerie stillness of the place. The motel seemed deserted, with no one around. The silence was so complete that she could hear the wind whistling through the cracks in the walls, shaking off the unease that had suddenly crept into her mind. Sarah grabbed her purse and walked toward the office. The door squeaked open, and the bell above it chimed loudly in the otherwise quiet air. Behind the counter stood an elderly man, his eyes hidden beneath thick, round glasses, his face covered in a scraggly beard. He looked up as Sarah entered, but said nothing. His gaze lingered on her for an unervingly long moment. "Hi, I'd like a room for the night," Sarah said, forcing a smile. "Just one." The man didn't speak, but instead nodded toward the old register. He scribbled something on a piece of paper and slid it across the counter to her. She took the key from the counter and handed over the money, a little put off by how distant the man seemed. But she didn't say anything, just grabbed the key and turned to leave. The man's voice stopped her as she reached the door. "Room 8, he muttered, barely above a whisper. "You might want to check under the bed when you get in." Sarah paused, a chill running down her spine at his strange words. But she shook it off, thinking maybe he was just an eccentric old man. "Thanks," she replied, forcing a smile, and walked back out the door, feeling his eyes on her until she disappeared around the corner. She didn't think too much of it as she made her way to room 8. The cold air bit at her skin as she approached the door, her breath forming small clouds in front of her. The room was located at the far end of the building, and it looked as though it hadn't been occupied in a while. The dim light from the street lamp outside cast long shadows across the parking lot as she inserted the key into the lock. The door creaked open. The room was exactly as she expected, shabby, outdated, and with an old, uncomfortable-looking bed. But it was warm, and that's all that mattered. She tossed her purse onto the bed and began to unpack her things, deciding to take a quick shower before getting some rest. But as she walked past the bed, she hesitated. The man's words came back to her, "Check under the bed." Sarah rolled her eyes, chastising herself for being so paranoid. She'd heard plenty of weird things about small motels, but this was ridiculous. Still, something made her crouch down and peek under the bed. Nothing. She sighed with relief and stood up, about to walk back to the bathroom when a sudden noise made her freeze. It was faint, but it sounded like the unmistakable sound of something, or someone, shifting under the bed. Her heart raced. She slowly crouched down again, this time her pulse pounding in her ears. She looked under the bed one more time, this time more carefully. Her breath caught in her throat when she saw it, a faint outline of something moving under the dust and cobwebs. Suddenly, something grabbed her wrist, a cold, bony hand with fingers like long, gnarled tree roots wrapped around her arm, and Sarah screamed. The grip tightened. She jerked backward, stumbling away from the bed, her heart pounding so hard in her chest it felt like it might burst. The hand withdrew slowly, and she could see the shadow of something lying under the bed. It wasn't a person. It was a dark shape, like a shadow, but shaped like a human. A strange, lingering presence. Breathing heavily, Sarah scrambled toward the door. Her feet slipped on the worn carpet as she backed up, her hands trembling as she reached for the door handle. Just as her fingers brushed the cold metal, the phone on the nightstand rang. She froze. There was no reason for anyone to call. No one knew she was here. The phone continued to ring. Hesitant, she picked it up, her hand shaking so much that the receiver almost slipped from her grip. "Hello?" she said, her voice tight. For a moment, there was nothing but static on the other end. Then, slowly, a voice came through, low, raspy, and almost unintelligible. "Get out of the room. Now." It was the man from the front desk. Before she could respond, The line went dead. Fear surged through her, and Sarah didn't waste another second. She dropped the phone back onto the nightstand and bolted out the door, running toward her car in a panic. Her heart was racing as she fumbled for her keys, all the while glancing nervously over her shoulder. Every shadow seemed to twist and move. Every creak of the building behind her was louder than it should have been. As she climbed into her car and slammed the door shut, she glanced at the window. A dark figure was standing by room 8, just outside the door. She couldn't see its face, but she could feel its eyes on her, watching her with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. Without a second thought, Sarah started the car and sped off, her tires screeching as she drove away. She didn't look back, not once. The next morning, she returned to the highway, her heart still racing, and when she passed the sign for Pinewood Motel, it was gone. There was no sign of it. No broken building, no parking lot, nothing but the empty stretch of road ahead. And Sarah knew, deep down, that she had narrowly escaped something she would never be able to explain. Something that lived in that motel, waiting for the next traveler to pass through.